this identification is on scientific developments and inventions, as well as an in-depth exploration of the space program since John F. Kennedy. And this probably will be one of the questions on the essay test. But this idea will start with some problems with science in the part of class part of history we're covering. We see here the Exxon Valdez. Okay, so yeah, the Exxon Valdez was one of the worst. Well, actually, it was the worst oil spill in U.S. history. And it happened in Alaska and actually ended up being the worst in world history. Oil spill, a vast amount of oil was dumped in the ocean as a result of the accident. A great environmental disaster. Another oil spill that was a result of an explosion was the Deepwater Horizon, which was in 2010. And a number of the workers were killed, as well as oil was spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. A recent film was made about this called Deepwater Horizon. And so there's a number of environmental issues and problems. One of the worst going on is the much of the Amazon rainforest being chopped down for resources and for development. And when you cut down that many trees, it affects the carbon dioxide level in the air and less oxygen is put in the air when you cut down this vast amount of forest. So this is a major crisis going on in the Amazon forest. In the United States, you have the Love Canal, which was another pollution disaster. And so this occurred in the 1970s in Niagara Falls area of New York, in which hazardous chemicals were released into the water and affected residents in the area of toxic waste. And then one of the nuclear events was the Chernobyl catastrophe in Russia, in which large areas of that area are uninhabitable will be for decades. There was a nuclear leak here in the United States, also at 3 Mile Island in 1979. Okay, so and we also will be talking about many of the inventions. And something in class, I would ask, like, what inventions can you think of that have occurred since, say, 1960? So that's something to think about on your own too. Is what inventions do you use, and what type of inventions have come along, and I'm certain that you could come up with quite a few on your own. But certainly the computer is one, and this isn't a laptop, but eventually laptops. And this is something that occurred in the 80s, the first used by consumers. Another example of an invention is the cell phone. I mean, we've certainly covered the invention of phones, but the invention of the cell phone in the 90s started to become used by people in general. Was a big change, and now obviously you have Android phones and iPhones and all kinds of other things. Phones are used as mini computers. Certainly VH tapes where films could be watched or video recorders could be used to record personal events. Um, Now you have streaming and phones recording and meetings online, as you know. So that's just a few inventions, something to think about on your own, about inventions in general. One of the biggest scientific changes has been, and we've covered a little bit already of John F. Kennedy and the space program in the 60s, but this is Freedom 7, which is the first um, spaceship really to go into space with an astronaut. So Alan Shepard was in orbit for 15 minutes, but that was the first major event. Then you have the Apollo program, which started out horribly with the death of 3 astronauts um, before the ship had even been launched into space. A fire on board killed the 3 astronauts and almost ended the Apollo program. Apollo 8 was a major advancement in space travel. So Apollo 8 was the first crewed ship to orbit the moon, and it received headlines. You see here, Apollo 8 sweeps into incredible Christmas Eve orbit around the moon in 1968. So Apollo 11 is probably the most famous Apollo mission, and this one brought the first man on the moon. And so Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon, followed by Buzz Aldrin, and the pilot. He stayed in the ship with Michael Collins. It's a recent film, Apollo 11, which is a documentary of all the footage and of the trip. And so, yeah, Apollo 11 is a documentary of the trip. Apollo 12 was another successful mission to the moon. No, again, here we see a picture of um, the famous quote that Armstrong said, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Right, Apollo 11, which was just recently out. Possibly the most, almost as famous as the moon landing was Apollo 13. But this one was famous for the almost death of the astronauts, in which the astronauts said on the radio, Houston, we have a problem. So when James Lovell said this, he was talking about a catastrophe that was occurring where they were losing oxygen and all kinds of technical problems were happening. So they needed to come back to Earth, and they had to actually move into the lunar module and basically use tape and rubber bands and things to try and fix the problem up there, this unplanned problem. So it became a riveting thing that was broadcast all over the world. You can see this is a real life picture of the real tension that was going on in the Space Command here on Earth. This is the family of the astronaut watching the whole thing unfold on television. So here's a newspaper, Apollo 13, Three Spacemen and Fight for Life. These are example of newspapers all across the country. But this was actually covered worldwide also. And, and people across the world became captivated as to would these astronauts succeed in surviving the trip back. And they did. After a period of radio silence, they did survive and got back to Earth and with barely enough oxygen. So that was the story of Apollo 13. And then there was another mission, Apollo 17. Apollo 11 wasn't the only moon landing. There were actually six moon landings, manned moon landings, but Apollo 17 was the last one. This is a documentary on Apollo 17, but yeah, it was the last moon landing, and it occurred in 1972. So after that, a new type of spacecraft was invented. It's called a space shuttle, and these were popular with NASA from 1981 to 2011. And the thing about these were they were reusable spacecraft, where previously it was only one and out. There was 135 missions, but only six spacecraft. They had multiple missions, and there were two very deadly crashes or explosions. The first deadly accident occurred with the Challenger. The first civilian and also teacher in space was killed in this, which was a real shock. It was very widely watched, and the accident occurred actually on live on television when the ship blew up in the sky, and so the first teacher and civilian in space died, and as well as the entire crew: Gregory Jarvis, Judith Resnick, Dick Scobie, Ronald McNair, and Michael Smith, and Ellison Onizuka. Um, and then in 2003, the Columbia crew was killed. The entire crew perished in a space shuttle disaster. So then a major change occurred in the space program in which the International Space Station was launched in 1998, and it's still going today. And this was a space station. It's called international because crews from many different countries are on it. It's shared by multiple countries. So basically, we're talking about 18 different countries have had astronauts of all types living on the space station. It's a permanent station that orbits the globe every 90 minutes. And many scientific experiments and communications experiments have occurred on it. See, these astronauts are from Japan, Russia, and the United States. Here's two Canadian crew members. There's a picture of Sally Ride. She's the first American woman in space in 1983, and she's logged over 243 hours of space flight. There's another shot of the space station. It's gigantic. they say about the size of 2 football fields, so there's a lot of interior space. No, this is Franklin Chang Diaz. He wrote, "My vision is a future for humanity where we will be completely free to pursue activities outside of our planet." I believe Diaz is actually writing a book about his rise from a migrant worker. He learned English at the age of 12, and then after many tries became an astronaut eventually, and has lived on and orbited on the space station. Well, there's a sign of having been on this station for 2,000 hours. There's a picture of Peggy Whitson. She spent almost 2 years in space, and she broke all records for a woman in space. A quote of hers: "Our ship continues to sail as a testament to what can be accomplished by a very determined group of people." And we see here, oh, scientific exercise science is a very large thing on these space stations with extended time that's spent on living in these stations. So exercise science is many kinds of laboratories and different kinds of exercise equipment, different kinds of weightlifting equipment and treadmills. There's zero gravity, remember, so it's quite a feat to exercise with effectiveness. Another huge thing they're working on is um, cures for different diseases, and they're working on a cure for cancer on the International Space Station. Variety of uh, medical research is being done, including Parkinson's disease is a major form of research. They've actually one of the astronauts has Parkinson's disease. Not this one, but this is uh, someone doing research on Parkinson's, and they think they're making a lot of progress in that. More on cancer cures. Parkinson's disease research is a major medical project they're working on. A spacewalk. There's also uh, spacewalks outside to do repairs to keep this station going. They have to repair it almost as if it's a building. And then another major thing is food science. Obviously, food is a major issue on these long trips, and it's continuous year-round trip. And so you see food being grown on the International Space Station. Food science and preparation. So not only does it have to be sustainable, but it has to be safe, and obviously it needs to taste good. You see the apples and oranges floating around because there's no gravity on the International Space Station. Floating pizzas. Okay, so the space program then it began, with Apollo and the moon landings, and then you have the space shuttle and now currently the International Space Program, which brings in people from all different countries, and we see on the space station medical research and new leaps in technology this can be used on Earth. So that concludes this uh, discussion.